One of the most popular question types on the GMAT is the weaken the argument question. These questions provide us with a complete argument, and the answer choices consist of additional premises. Your job is to find the answer choice that, when added to the argument, undermines the conclusion the most. In other words, when we add the new premise to the argument, the conclusion does not follow as well from the premises as it originally did. Now, how do we know we're looking at a weaken the argument question? Well, we can tell by the question stem. Don't forget that reading the question stem is the very first step in the general strategy. Here are some examples of question stems that would accompany a weaken the argument question. Which of the following, if true, most seriously weakens the argument above? Which of the following, if true, would cast the most serious doubt on the researcher's conclusion? Which of the following, if true, most effectively challenges the conclusion that releasing 100 dragonfish into Chilliwack Lake will allow the gigafish in Chilliwack Lake to survive? Which of the following, if established, most seriously calls into question the argument above? And which of the following, if true, most seriously undermines the spokesperson's position? As you can see, there are many different ways to essentially say which of these new premises hurts the argument the most. Now, once you've read a few dozen question stems for weaken the argument questions, you'll be able to spot this question type from a mile away. Okay, now once we've identified the question type, what do we do next? Well, now we read the passage and focus on the information required to answer weaken the argument questions. This is where we move from the general strategy to the strategy specific to weaken the argument questions. As we read the passage that accompanies a weaken the argument question, the first and most important step is to identify and summarize the conclusion. Since the question is asking us to weaken the extent to which the conclusion follows from the premises, we must be able to identify and articulate that conclusion. So our goal is to not only identify the conclusion, but also summarize it so that we can fully understand it. From here, our next step is to summarize the premises that support the conclusion. Now, I should mention that steps 1 and 2 can be performed at the same time. That is, you can identify and summarize each line as either a conclusion or a premise as you work your way through the passage. I have made identifying and summarizing the conclusion as step 1 in order to emphasize the relative importance of identifying the conclusion. Okay, so once we've completed the first 2 steps, we will have encapsulated the entire argument in only a handful of words, so we should never have to go back and reread the original argument. At this point, we should try to identify any unstated assumptions in the argument. These are assumptions that are necessary for the conclusion to follow from the premises. This is a useful step, because the best answer in a weaken the argument question is often a new premise that undermines one of the unstated assumptions in the argument. Now, having said that, you should avoid spending too much time on step 3. For many arguments, there can be several unstated assumptions. So even if you identify 2 or 3 of them, it's quite possible that none of the answer choices are related to those particular assumptions that you identified. So really your goal should be to quickly identify an assumption or 2 before moving on to the next step, which is checking each answer choice while reminding yourself of the conclusion. One of the most common mistakes that people make on this question type is that they attempt to weaken a conclusion that does not match the actual conclusion in the argument. So once you have identified the conclusion, be sure to remind yourself of that conclusion. So, for example, if the conclusion of an argument is that eating carrots improves one's eyesight, then as you check each answer choice, keep asking, does this weaken the conclusion that eating carrots improves one's eyesight? Does this weaken the conclusion that eating carrots improves one's eyesight? And so on. Doing so will ensure that you don't fall for any of the trap answers that are not related to the actual conclusion. Finally, as always, be sure to check all of the answer choices. Okay, so this is the basic strategy for handling weaken the argument questions. Now let's examine some additional tips to consider as you follow these steps. First, as you're reading the argument, determine whether it's one of the common argument types we examined earlier, and recall the different ways to weaken those types of arguments. Next, as you check the answer choices, keep in mind the 2 most common ways of weakening an argument. They are undermining an unstated assumption and adding a new premise that hurts the conclusion. Also keep in mind that your goal here is to weaken the argument, not to destroy the argument. In other words, your task is to simply lessen the extent to which the conclusion follows from the premises. So even if an answer choice does not completely destroy an argument, it's still quite possible that that answer choice is the best answer. Next, beware of answer choices that strengthen the argument. As you will learn in future lessons, another popular question type is the strengthen the argument question. So if you don't pay attention to what the question stem is asking, you may inadvertently select the answer choice that strengthens the argument. Now the test makers know that some people will make this mistake, so most weaken the argument questions will have at least one answer choice that strengthens the argument. Just beware of this trap. Another tip to consider is do not seek to disprove a premise. Remember that we must accept all premises as true, so disproving a premise is not an option. Finally, be sure to remember that our ultimate goal is to weaken the extent to which the conclusion follows from the premises. Okay, so those are some additional tips to consider when tackling weaken the argument questions. Now let's summarize. In this lesson, we learned the strategy for solving weaken the argument questions.